There is a moment in every high-stakes gamble when the cards on the table stop being hypothetical, when the chips stop being a metaphor, when the strategy you bet everything on stops being a theory and starts being a consequence. That moment for the United States of America, for its allies, for the entire architecture of the global order that was built over 80 years of diplomacy, war, sacrifice, and carefully negotiated trust, that moment is now. Right now, not in the future tense, not in the language of economists warning about theoretical risks, not in the careful, hedged language of think tanks and foreign policy journals that most people never read. Right now, in real time, country by country, deal by deal, meeting by meeting, the world is moving on without America. And the man who made the biggest bet in modern presidential history, the man who looked at the most powerful alliance network ever assembled, looked at 7 decades of American-led global order, looked at the friends, the partners, the treaties, the institutions, and said, I can do this better alone. That man is watching his gamble come apart at the seams. This is not a partisan talking point. This is not liberal media spin. This is what the data says. This is what the diplomatic cables say. This is what the market analysts say. This is what America's own closest allies, Canada, the UK, Germany, Japan, Australia, are saying with their actions, even when they're too polite to say it with their words. Donald Trump made the biggest foreign policy gamble of the 21st century, and it is starting to backfire on the world stage in ways that may take decades to undo. Stay with me, because what's happening right now is far bigger than a trade dispute. Far bigger than tariff percentages and press conference headlines. What we are witnessing is the unraveling of the American world order, and the story of how we got here is one you need to understand completely. Let's go back to the promise. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, the message was unmistakable. America first. Economic dominance. No more being taken advantage of. No more footing the bill for allies who don't pull their weight. No more trade deals that hollow out the American heartland while Beijing laughs all the way to the bank. It was a powerful message for millions of Americans who had watched manufacturing jobs disappear, who had watched their towns hollow out while politicians in Washington spoke endlessly about the rules-based international order. Trump's pitch felt like clarity in a fog of complicated diplomatic language. He would use tariffs as a weapon. He would use America's economic size as leverage. He would force allies to pay more for defense. He would confront China directly, without apology, without concession, without the diplomatic niceties that had in his framing allowed Beijing to steal the 21st century from America. The theory was simple. If the United States is the most powerful economy on earth, then the United States holds the ultimate card. Hit them with tariffs, they'll come crawling back. Threaten to leave NATO, they'll start paying up. Demand territorial concessions, they'll respect strength they'd never shown in response to polite diplomacy, strength, leverage, domination. That was the theory. Now let's talk about what actually happened. By the time Trump stood at Davos in January 2026 at the World Economic Forum, surrounded by the very global elite, he had spent a decade railing against the cracks in the strategy were already visible, not hairline fractures you needed a microscope to find. Wide structural cracks that the world's most respected analysts were documenting in real time. Trump had, by that point in his second term, threatened tariffs against nearly every significant trading partner the United States has: Canada, Mexico, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, China. He had hit 8 NATO allies with 10% tariffs, with warnings that those rates would climb to 25% by summer. He had threatened to reclaim the Panama Canal. He had demanded Denmark hand over Greenland. He had launched a military operation in Venezuela. He had bombed Iranian nuclear facilities alongside Israel. He had initiated what historians may eventually call the most aggressive American foreign policy posture since the Cold War. And from the podium in Davos, he did something remarkable even by his own standards. He publicly insulted the leaders of France, Canada, and several other allied nations. Leaders who had flown thousands of miles to listen to the President of the United States speak. Critics argue that what Trump displayed at Davos was not strength, it was contempt, and the world's leaders who had spent the previous year quietly recalibrating, quietly exploring alternatives, quietly hedging their bets began moving faster. Because here is the thing about using leverage. It only works as long as the other side believes they need you more than they need anyone else. And one by one, quietly, Diplomatically, but unmistakably, America's partners started making a different calculation. The first visible cracks came from Canada. Canada, America's largest trading partner, a country that shares the longest peaceful border in the world with the United States, a country that fought alongside American soldiers in every major conflict of the last century, a country whose prime minister had, up until recently, been considered one of Washington's most reliable friends. In January 2026, Canada and China announced a preliminary trade agreement, a framework to reduce trade barriers between Ottawa and Beijing. The response from the White House was fury. Trump publicly blasted Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. But analysts watching closely noted something significant. The fury was proof that the strategy had produced the exact opposite of its intended result. Trump had threatened Canada with punishing tariffs. He had called it the 51st state. He had publicly humiliated its leaders. And what had Canada done? Not capitulated, not come to the table on Trump's terms. Canada had picked up the phone and called Beijing. And Beijing, which had been patiently waiting for exactly this moment, answered immediately. That same month, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer flew to Beijing for what both sides described as a reset of relations. The UK, America's most loyal ally in Europe, the country that stood shoulder to shoulder with Washington through Iraq, Afghanistan, the Cold War, 2 world wars, was in Beijing, opening new trade corridors, lowering barriers, resetting ties with President Xi Jinping. Ireland's prime minister made the same trip. Finland's prime minister made it. Ireland, Finland, countries that had historically been models of Western alignment, countries that had built their security frameworks on the assumption that American guarantees meant something permanent, were in Beijing recalibrating. Then the European Union. Analysts had warned for years that pushing Europe too hard would have consequences. In early 2026, the EU finalized a long-delayed free trade agreement with India. It made significant progress on its trade deal with Mercosur, the South American trading bloc. It was building the architecture of a global trade network that does not have Washington at its center. Risk analysts at Verisk Maplecroft documented it in data. Their measurements of verbal tensions between countries showed the sharpest spikes in U.S. relations with Canada, Denmark, Belgium, Japan, Ireland, New Zealand, and France. Not adversaries, not rivals, but allies. Friends, the people who were supposed to be on America's side. Damien Ma, director of Carnegie China, captured it with striking clarity. He told CNBC that countries were now aligning based on specific, a la carte interests rather than comprehensive, values-based alignment. A flood of countries, he warned, was beginning to recalibrate, and the UK and Canada would not be the last. He was right. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely alarming, not just politically, not just diplomatically, but in the deepest strategic sense. Donald Trump built his entire political brand around one central argument, that China was the enemy, that China had robbed America blind, that every previous administration had been weak, naive, or corrupt in its dealings with Beijing, and that he, Donald Trump, would be the man to finally break China's rise, to correct what he called the greatest theft of wealth in the history of the world. That was the promise. What analysts are documenting in 2026 is something that would have been almost unthinkable when Trump made that promise. The trade war against China has not slowed China's global ascent. According to a detailed analysis published in March 2026, Trump's policies are not defeating China on the world stage. They are accelerating China's rise. Think about that. A 2026 Federal Reserve Bank of New York study found that roughly 90% of the tariff burden from Trump's trade war fell on American businesses and American households. Not on China, not on Chinese factories, not on the Chinese Communist Party. On American families paying more for goods at the grocery store, paying more for appliances, paying more for manufacturing inputs. The tariffs, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, added approximately 0.7 percentage points to the U.S. inflation rate through late 2025. The Tax Foundation estimated they would reduce U.S. GDP by measurable percentages before even accounting for foreign retaliation. The strategy was sold as a weapon pointed at China. Analysts argue it functioned as a tax on America. And while American consumers were absorbing higher prices, China was busy, not panicking, not collapsing, busy. Beijing was building new trade networks across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. It was deepening its economic relationships with countries that were suddenly less confident in American reliability. In January 2026, China led the Will for Peace BRICS Plus naval exercises off South Africa, a direct signal that Beijing was expanding into security domains that had been exclusively dominated by Western powers for decades. China essentially stopped buying American exports after April 2025, according to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. What was supposed to be leverage, the threat of Chinese economic pain, became an accelerant of Chinese diversification. Beijing found new buyers, new suppliers, new corridors. Even Secretary of State Marco Rubio, in late February 2026, effectively acknowledged what critics had been saying for over a year. He called the new U.S.-China relationship one of strategic stability language that analysts immediately identified as diplomatic code for the trade war didn't achieve its goals, and we need to move on before the midterm elections. Strategic stability. Translated from diplomatic language into plain English. We lost that round, and we're not ready to admit it publicly. Here is what most coverage of Trump's trade war misses. Here is the layer underneath the tariffs and the press conferences and the bluster. The United States dollar is the world's reserve currency. That is not just a financial fact, it is the foundation of American global power. The ability to print dollars, to borrow cheaply, to sanction enemies by cutting them off from the dollar system, this is the deepest source of American leverage on the planet, more than any aircraft carrier, more than any military base, more than any trade agreement. And analysts warn that Trump's gamble is putting even that at risk. Europe, America's most economically significant partner, holds approximately $8 trillion in U.S. bonds and equities. $8 trillion. That is almost twice as much as the rest of the world combined. And financial analysts at major institutions have warned that if the trade war escalates, if the threats become reality, if Europe decides it has run out of options, that $8 trillion becomes a weapon pointed in the other direction. Bloomberg analysts described any weaponization of European holdings as representing a severe escalation, one that would expand a trade war into a full financial confrontation. Fortune reported European analysts openly discussing what they called the Sell America option, the idea that if pushed far enough, Europe could move its reserves out of U.S. assets in ways that would shake the foundations of American financial supremacy. This is not a fringe scenario. These are the conversations happening in the offices of Europe's central banks and finance ministries, quietly, carefully, but happening. Meanwhile, independent economic analysts note that the dollar's dominance is already showing stress. Countries are increasingly looking to reduce their exposure to a currency controlled by an administration that has demonstrated it will weaponize financial tools against allies as readily as it does against adversaries. The distinction between friend and foe, which was the entire basis of the dollar's trustworthiness as a global reserve, is blurring. And once trust in the dollar's neutrality erodes, critics argue, it is not something you can simply recover by reversing a few tariffs and giving a speech at Davos. Something historic is being assembled right now in the world's diplomatic corridors, and most people are not paying close enough attention to it. The European Union and India signed a long-awaited free trade agreement in January 2026, a deal that had been stalled for years, that suddenly found momentum precisely because both sides recognized that the rules of global trade were shifting and they needed to build new architecture without relying on Washington to provide stability. The EU-Mercosur deal connecting Europe with South America's major economies in a trading bloc that would represent hundreds of millions of consumers is advancing with new urgency for exactly the same reason. Australia, Japan, South Korea, countries in the Indo-Pacific that have been America's most committed security partners in Asia are quietly asking questions they have never asked before. What happens if the security guarantee is conditional? What happens if the next crisis comes and Washington decides the deal isn't worth it? Politico framed it with precision. If allies begin to genuinely believe that the United States simply will not be there when a security crisis arrives, we are looking at a geopolitical reordering the scale of which has not been seen since the end of World War II. The Atlantic published what may be the most significant foreign policy headline of the year, describing Trump's own national security strategy as making it official. The American-dominated liberal world order is over, not threatened, not under strain. Over. Those words came not from foreign critics, not from Beijing's state media. They came from an American publication, analyzing an American government document. The world that America built after 1945, the world of NATO, of Bretton Woods institutions, of rules-based trade, of collective security, of American guarantees underwriting the stability of the entire international system, that world is being deliberately dismantled. And the countries that prospered under it are beginning to build something new, something that does not have Washington at its center. Russia's Vladimir Putin, watching all of this, has refused to concede anything in Ukraine. Putin has taken maximalist positions in every negotiation, demanding NATO membership be permanently denied to Ukraine, demanding territorial control of Donbass, demanding limits on Ukraine's military precisely because he reads the fracturing of Western unity as the single greatest strategic gift he has received in his career. China's Xi Jinping is studying the dissolution of American alliance credibility with the same focused patience that has defined Beijing's strategic posture for decades and is preparing accordingly, including the deployment of new military barges designed specifically for a potential Taiwan invasion. The adversaries are not panicking. The adversaries are waiting. And in Washington, the debate is no longer about whether the strategy is working. The debate behind closed doors, in Republican Senate offices, in conversations between White House advisors and economic analysts, is about how to manage the political damage before the 2026 midterm elections. Let's be honest about what this moment represents. This is not simply a story about tariffs and trade deficits and diplomatic rudeness at Davos. This is a story about the fundamental question of what kind of world we are going to live in. For 80 years, the architecture of global stability was built on a specific idea that the United States, for all its flaws, was a reliable anchor, that American security guarantees meant something, that American trade relationships, while sometimes contentious, operated within a framework of rules and norms. That being allied with America, whatever the irritations and the costs, was ultimately safer and more prosperous than the alternative. That idea is the foundation of the entire post-war world. It is the reason Germany is not armed to the teeth. It is the reason Japan operates without a full offensive military capability. It is the reason dozens of countries structured their economies, their foreign policies, their security architectures around the assumption of American reliability. And critics argue that what the Trump administration has done, not accidentally but deliberately as a stated policy, is shatter that assumption. Analysts at the Stimson Center, in their top 10 global risks for 2026, placed what they called Trump's economic morass at the top of their list, above climate change, above nuclear proliferation, above regional conflicts. The deliberate dismantling of the rules-based order, they argued, represents the single greatest structural risk facing the international system in 2026. The IMF warned in January 2026 that Trump's tariff threats risk triggering a spiral of escalation that would damage the world economy and lead to sharp downturns across multiple continents. Not a recession, a spiral. The Eurasia Group, in its annual Global Risk Report, described 2026 as a tipping point and identified the United States itself as the top source of global instability. Not Russia, not China, not any adversarial power. The United States of America, under its current foreign policy posture, as the number one risk to global stability. That is not an argument. That is not an opinion column. That is the conclusion of one of the world's most respected political risk firms, whose job is to give unbiased analysis to governments and institutions across the globe. And here is the deeper tragedy, the part that critics on both sides of the aisle are beginning to grapple with. Even if the United States reverses course tomorrow, even if a new administration in 2029 or beyond decides to recommit to NATO, to trade partnerships, to multilateral institutions, to the entire apparatus of American global leadership, the damage to trust may not be reversible. Because the question every ally is now asking is not, what is America doing today? The question is, what will America do next time? And after everything that has happened, that question can no longer be answered with the simple confidence it once was. Countries don't build alternative trade networks and alternative security arrangements and alternative financial architectures for fun. They build them because they need them. because they've decided the risk of not having them is greater than the cost of building them. And when those alternatives are built, when the infrastructure of a post-American world order is in place, walking it back is not a matter of a speech or a treaty or a policy reversal. It is a generational project, if it's possible at all. Here's what I want you to sit with. There is a version of this story where it turns out fine, where the pressure works, where the world comes back to the table, where the deals get made and the alliances hold and the historians look back and say, yes, it was rough, but in the end, the leverage was real and America emerged stronger. That version of the story is still possible. History is not written yet. But here is what we know, not what we fear, not what we suspect, but what we actually know based on documented facts and measurable developments. We know that Canada, America's neighbor, America's brother, America's most trusted trading partner, made a trade deal with China rather than capitulate to Washington's demands. We know that Britain, America's most historically steadfast ally, flew to Beijing to reset its relationship with Xi Jinping. We know that 90% of the tariff burden fell on American families. We know that China's global reach is expanding, not contracting. We know that Putin has refused every reasonable negotiated settlement in Ukraine, emboldened by the fracturing of Western unity. We know that the dollar's role as an unquestioned anchor of global finance is being actively questioned. We know that the world's most respected risk analysts have placed the United States at the top of their list of global threats, not as a power to fear in the military sense, but as a source of institutional and economic instability that no one can plan around. And we know that right now, in diplomatic chambers from Brussels to Tokyo to Ottawa to New Delhi, world leaders are doing something they have not seriously done since 1945, planning for a world in which they cannot count on America. The gamble was enormous. The stated ambition was legitimate to rebuild American power, to stop the hollowing out of American industry, to force free riders to pay their share. None of that is an unreasonable goal, but the method, the approach, the idea that you can treat allies the way you treat adversaries, that you can humiliate partners and call it strength, that you can shatter trust built over generations and replace it with a transaction. That idea is what analysts, diplomats, and economists are now examining against the evidence of what's actually happened. And the verdict so far is not encouraging. The biggest gamble in modern American foreign policy history is playing out in real time. The table is still active. The cards are still in play. But right now, in this moment, the chips are moving in a direction that should make every American who believes in this country's role in the world, regardless of party, regardless of ideology, stop and pay very serious attention, because the world is not waiting for America to figure this out. The world is moving on. And the question that history will eventually answer, the question that is being decided right now in the meetings America is not invited to, in the deals being struck without Washington's blessing, in the quiet recalibrations of decades-long alliances, is whether America moves with it or gets left behind. If this video made you think, if it made you angry, if it made you want to know more, hit that subscribe button, because what's coming next is going to be even bigger, and you need to be watching when it does. We'll see you in the next one.